Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to read the story In the Deathroom from Stephen King's Everything's Eventual. This will be a two-parter, and we'll close out October. In the Deathroom. It was a death room. Fletcher knew it for what it was as soon as the door opened. The floor was gray industrial tile. The walls were discolored white stone, marked here and there with darker patches that might have been blood. Certainly blood had been spilled in this room. The overhead lights were cupped in wire cages. Halfway across the room stood a long wooden table with 3 people seated behind it. Before the table was an empty chair, waiting for Fletcher. Beside the chair stood a small wheeled trolley. The object on it had been draped with a piece of cloth, as a sculptor might cover his work in progress between sessions. Fletcher was half led, half dragged toward the chair which had been placed for him. He reeled in the guard's grip and let himself reel. If he looked more dazed than he really was, more shocked and unthinking, that was fine. He thought his chances of ever leaving this basement room in the Ministry of Information were perhaps 1 or 2 in 30. And perhaps that was optimistic. Whatever they were, he had no intention of thinning them further by looking even halfway alert. His swelled eye, puffy nose, and broken lower lip might help in this regard. So might the crust of blood. But a dark red goatee around his mouth. One thing Fletcher knew for sure: if he did leave, the others, the guard and the 3 sitting in tribunal behind the table, would be dead. He was a newspaper reporter and had never killed anything much larger than a hornet, but if he had to kill to escape this room, he would. He thought of his sister on her retreat. He thought of his sister swimming in a river with a Spanish name. He thought of the light on the water at noon, moving river light, too bright to look at. They reached the chair in front of the table. The guard pushed him into it so hard that Fletcher almost tipped himself over. "Careful now, that's not the way, no accidents," said one of the men behind the table. It was Escobar. He spoke to the guard in Spanish. To Escobar's left sat the other man. To Escobar's right sat a woman of about 60. The woman and the other man were thin. Escobar was fat and as greasy as a cheap candle. He looked like a movie Mexican. You expected him to say, "Batches? Batches? We don't need no stinking batches." Yet this was the chief minister of information. Sometimes he gave the English language portion of the weather on the city television station. When he did this, he invariably got fan mail. In a suit, he didn't look greasy, just roly-poly. Fletcher knew all this. He had done 3 or 4 stories on Escobar. He was colorful. He was also, according to rumor, an enthusiastic torturer, a Central American Himmler, Fletcher thought, and was amazed to discover that one sense of humor, rudimentary, granted, could function this far into a state of horror. "Handcuffs?" the guard asked, also in Spanish, and held up a pair of the plastic kind. Fletcher tried to keep his look of dazed incomprehension. If they cuffed him, it was over. He could forget about 1 chance in 30, or 1 in 300. Escobar turned briefly to the woman on his right. Her face was very dark, her hair black with startling white streaks. It flowed back and up from her forehead as if blown by a gale-force wind. The look of her hair reminded Fletcher of Elsa Lanchester in Bride of Frankenstein. He gripped this similarly with a fierceness that was close to panic. The way he gripped the thought of bright light on the river, or his sister laughing with her friends as they walked to the water. He wanted images, not ideas. Images were luxury items now, and ideas were no good in a place like this. In a place like this, all you got were the wrong ideas. The woman gave Escobar a small nod. Fletcher had seen her around the building, always garbed in shapeless dresses like the one she wore now. She had been with Escobar often enough for Fletcher to assume she was his secretary, personal assistant, perhaps even his biographer. Christ knew that men like Escobar had egos large enough to warrant such accessories. Now Fletcher wondered if he'd had it backward all along, if she was his boss. In any case, the nod seemed to satisfy Escobar. When he turned back to Fletcher, Escobar was smiling, and when he spoke, it was in English. "Don't be silly. Put them away. Mr. Fletcher is only here to help us in a few matters. He will soon be returning to his own country." Escobar sighed deeply to show how deeply he regretted this. "But in the meantime, he is an honored guest." "We don't need no stinking handcuffs," Fletcher thought. The woman who looked like the bride of Frankenstein with a very deep tan leaned toward Escobar and whispered briefly behind her hand. Escobar nodded, smiling. "Of course, Ramon. If our guest should try anything foolish or make any aggressive moves, you would have to shoot him a little." He roared laughter, roly-poly TV laughter, and then repeated what he had said in Spanish so that Ramon would understand as well as Fletcher. Ramon nodded seriously, replaced his handcuffs on his belt, and stepped back to the periphery of Fletcher's vision. Escobar returned his attention to Fletcher. From one pocket to his parrot and foliage-studded gallibera, he removed a red and white package, Marlboros, the preferred cigarette of third-world peoples everywhere. "Smoke, Mr. Fletcher." Fletcher reached towards the pack, which Escobar had placed on the edge of the table, then withdrew his hand. He had quit smoking 3 years ago, and supposed he might take the habit up again if he actually did get out of this. Drinking high-tension liquor as well, quite likely, but at this moment he had no craving or need for a cigarette. He had wanted them to see his fingers shaking, that was all. Perhaps later. Right now, a cigarette might what? It might matter to Escobar. He just nodded understandingly and left the red and white pack where it was, on the edge of the table. Fletcher had a sudden agonizing vision in which he saw himself stopping at a newsstand on 43rd Street and buying a pack of Marlboros. A free man buying the happy poison on a New York street. He told himself that if he got out of this, he would do that. He would do it as some people went on pilgrimages to Rome or Jerusalem after their cancer was cured or their sight was restored. "The men who did that to you," Escobar indicated Fletcher's face with a wave of one not particularly clean hand, "have been disciplined. Yet not too harshly, and I myself stop short of apology, you will notice. Those men are patriots, as are we. As you are yourself, Mr. Fletcher, yes? I suppose it was his job to appear ingratitating and frightened, a man who would say anything in order to get out of here. It was Escobar's job to be soothing, to convince the man in the chair that his swelled eye, split lip, and loose teeth meant nothing. All that was just a misunderstanding which would soon be straightened out. And when it was, he would be free to go. They were still busy trying to deceive each other, even here in the death room. Escobar switched his attention to Ramon, the guard, and spoke in rapid Spanish. Fletcher's Spanish wasn't good enough to pick up everything, but you couldn't spend almost 5 years in the shithole capital city without picking up a fair vocabulary. Spanish wasn't the world's most difficult language, as both Escobar and his friend, the Bride of Frankenstein, undoubtedly knew. Escobar asked if Fletcher's things had been packed and if he had been checked out of the Hotel Magnificent. See, Escobar wanted to know if there was a car waiting outside the Ministry of Information to take Mr. Fletcher to the airport when the interrogation was done. See, around the corner, on the street 5th of May. Escobar turned back and said, "Do you understand what I ask him?" From Escobar, understand, came out understand, and Fletcher thought again of Escobar's TV appearances. Low pressure. What low pressure? We don't need no stinking low pressure. I ask, have you been checked out of your room? Although, after all this time, it probably seems more like an apartment to you, yes? And if there's a car to take you to the airport when we finish our conversation. Except conversation hadn't been the word he used. Yes, sounding as if he could not believe his own good fortune, or so Fletcher hoped. You'll be on the first Delta flight back to Miami, the Bride of Frankenstein said. She spoke without a trace of Spanish accent. Your passport will be given back to you once the plane has touched down on American soil. You will not be harmed or held here, Mr. Fletcher, not if you cooperate with our inquiries. But you are being deported. Let's be clear on that. Kicked out, given what you Americans call the bum's rush. She was much smoother than Escobar. Fletcher found it amusing that he had thought her Escobar's assistant. And you call yourself a reporter, he thought. Of course, if he was just a reporter, the Times man in Central America, he would not be here in the basement of the Ministry of Information, where the stains on the wall look suspiciously like blood. He had ceased being a reporter some 16 months ago, around the time he'd first met Nunez. I understand, Fletcher said. Escobar had taken a cigarette. He lighted it with a gold-plated Zippo. There was a fake ruby in the side of the Zippo. He said, Are you prepared to help us in our inquiries, Mr. Fletcher? Do I have a choice? You always have a choice, Escobar said. But I think you have worn out your carpet in our country, yes? Is that what you say? Worn out your carpet? Close enough, Fletcher said. He thought. What you must guard against is your desire to believe them. It is natural to want to believe, and probably natural to want to tell the truth, especially after you've been grabbed outside your favorite cafe and briskly beaten by men who smell of refried beans. But giving them what they want won't help you. That's the thing to hold on to. The only idea that's any good in a room like this. What they say means nothing. What matters is the thing on that trolley, the thing under that piece of cloth. What matters is the guy who hasn't said anything yet, and the stains on the walls, of course. Escobar leaned forward, looking serious. Do you deny that for the last 14 months you have given certain information to a man named Thomas Herrera, who has in turn funneled it to a certain communist insurgent named Pedro Nunez? No, Fletcher said. I don't deny it. To adequately keep up with his side of this charade, the charade summarized by the difference between the words conversation and interrogation, he should now justify. Attempt to explain, as if anyone in the history of the world had ever won a political argument in a room like this, but he didn't have it in him to do so. Although it was a little longer than that, almost a year and a half in all, I think. Have a cigarette, Mr. Fletcher. Escobar opened a drawer and took out a thin folder. Not just yet, thank you. Okay. From Escobar, it of course came out okay. When he did the TV weather, the boys in the control room would sometimes superimpose a photograph of a woman in a bikini on the weather map. When he saw this, Escobar would laugh and wave his hands and pat his chest. People liked it. It was comical. It was like the sound of hockey. It was like the sound of stinkin' batches. Escobar opened the folder with his own cigarette planted squarely in the middle of his mouth with the smoke running up into his eyes. It was the way you saw the old men smoking on the street corners down here, the ones who still wore straw hats, sandals, and baggy white pants. Now Escobar was smiling, keeping his lips shut so his Marlboro wouldn't fall out of his mouth and onto the table, but smiling just the same. He took a glossy black and white photograph out of the thin folder and slid it across to Fletcher. "Here is your friend Thomas. Not too pretty, is he?" It was a high-contrast, full-face shot. It made Fletcher think of photographs by that semi-famous news photographer of the 40s and 50s, the one who called himself Ouija. It was a portrait of a dead man. The eyes were open. The flash bulb had reflected in them, giving them a kind of life. There was no blood, only one mark and no blood. But still, one knew at once that the man was dead. His hair was combed. One could still see the tooth marks the comb had left, and there were those little lights in his eyes, but they were reflected lights. One knew at once the man was dead. The mark was on the left temple, a comet shape that looked like a powder burn, but there was no bullet hole, no blood, and the skull wasn't pushed out of shape. Even a low-caliber pistol like a .22 fired close enough to the skin to leave a powder burn would have pushed the skull out of shape. Escobar took the picture back, put it in a folder, closed the folder, and shrugged as if to say, "You see? You see what happens?" When he shrugged, the ash fell off his cigarette onto the table. He brushed it off onto the gray lino floor with the side of one fat hand. "We didn't actually want to bother you," Escobar said. "Why would we? This is a small country. We are small people in a small country. The New York Times, a big paper in a big country. We have our pride, of course, but we also have our..." Escobar tapped his temple with one finger. "You see?" Fletcher nodded. He kept seeing Thomas. Even with the picture back in the folder, he could see Thomas. The marks the comb had left in Thomas's black hair. He had eaten food Thomas's wife had cooked, had sat on the floor and watched cartoons with Thomas's youngest child, a little girl of perhaps 5. Tom and Jerry cartoons, with what little dialogue there was in Spanish. "We don't want to bother you," Escobar was saying, as the cigarette smoke rose and broke apart on his face and curled around his ears. "But for a long time, we was watching. You didn't see us, maybe because you are so big and we are just little, but we was watching. We know that you know that what Thomas knows, and so we go to him. We try to get him to tell what he knows so we don't have to bother you, but he won't. Finally, we ask Hines here to try and make him tell. Hines, show Mr. Fletcher how you try to make Thomas tell, when Thomas was sitting right where Mr. Fletcher was sitting now." "I can do that," said Hines. He spoke English in a nasal New York accent. He was bald, except for a fringe of hair around his ears. He wore little glasses. Escobar looked like a movie Mexican. The woman looked like Elsa Lanchester in Bride of Frankenstein. Hines looked like an actor in a TV commercial, the one who explained why Excedrin was best for your headache. He walked around the table to the trolley, gave Fletcher a look both roguish and conspiratorial, and flicked away the cloth over the top. There was a machine underneath, something with dials and lights, and were now all dark. Fletcher at first thought it was a lie detector. That made a certain amount of sense, but in front of the rudimentary control panel, connected to the side of the machine by a fat black cord, was an object with a rubber grip. It looked like a stylus or some sort of fountain pen. There was no nib, though. The thing just tapered to a blunt steel point. Below the machine was a shelf. On the shelf was a car battery marked Delco. There were rubber cups over the battery terminals. Wires rose from the rubber cups to the back of the machine. No, not a lie detector, except maybe to these people it was. Hines spoke briskly, with the pleasure of a man who likes to explain what he does. It's quite simple, really, a modification of the device neurologists use to administer electric shocks to people suffering unipolar neurosis. Only this administers a far more powerful jolt. The pain is really secondary, I find. Most people don't even remember the pain. What makes them so eager to talk is an aversion to the process. This might almost be called an atavism. Someday, I hope to write a paper. Hines picked up the stylus by its insulated rubber grip and held it in front of his eyes. This can be touched to the extremities, the torso, the genitals, of course. But it can also be inserted in places where, forgive the crudity, the sun never shines. A man whose shit has been electrified never forgets it, Mr. Fletcher. Did you do that to Thomas? No, Hines said, and replaced the stylus carefully in front of the shock generator. He got a jolt at half power on the hand, just to acquaint him with what he was up against, and when he still declined to discuss El Condor. Never mind that, the Bride of Frankenstein said. Beg pardon. When he still wouldn't tell us what we wanted to know, I applied the wand to his temple and administered another measured jolt. Carefully measured, I assure you. Half power, not a bit more. He had a seizure and died. I believe it may have been epilepsy. Did he have a history of epilepsy? Do you know, Mr. Fletcher? Fletcher shook his head. Nevertheless, I believe that's what it was. The autopsy revealed nothing wrong with his heart. Hines folded his long-fingered hands in front of him and looked at Escobar. Escobar removed his cigarette from the center of his mouth, looked at it, dropped it to the gray tile floor, stepped on it. Then he looked at Fletcher and smiled. Very sad, of course. Now I ask you some questions, Mr. Fletcher. Many of them. I tell you this frankly, are the questions Thomas Herrera refused to answer. I hope you will not refuse, Mr. Fletcher. I like you. You sit there in dignity. Do not cry or beg or urinate the pants. I like you. I know you only do what you believe. It is patriotism. So I tell you, my friend, it's good if you answer my questions quickly and truthfully. You don't want Hines to use his machine. I've said I'd help you, Fletcher said. Death was closer than the overhead lights in this cunning wire cages. Pain, unfortunately, was closer yet. And how close was Nunez? El Condor? El Condor. Closer than these three guessed, but not close enough to help him. If Escobar and the Bride of Frankenstein had waited another 2 days, perhaps even another 24 hours, but they had not, and he was here in the death room. Now he would see what he was made of. You said it, and you had better mean it, the woman said, speaking very, very clearly. We're not fucking around, gringo. I know you're not, Fletcher said in a sighing, trembling voice. You want that cigarette now, I think, said Escobar. And when Fletcher shook his head, Escobar took one himself, lit it, then seemed to meditate. At last he looked up. This cigarette was planted in the middle of his face like the last one. Nunez comes soon, he asked, like Zorro in that movie. Fletcher nodded. How soon? I don't know. Fletcher was very aware of Hines standing next to his infernal machine with his long-fingered hands folded in front of him, looking ready to talk about pain relievers at the drop of a cue. He was equally aware of Ramon standing to his right at the edge of his peripheral vision. He could not see, but guessed that Ramon's hand would be on the butt of his pistol. And here comes the next question. When he comes, will he strike at the garrison in the hills of El Candido, the garrison at Saint Therese, or will he come right into the city? The garrison at Saint Therese, Fletcher said. He will come to the city, Thomas had said while his wife and daughter now watched cartoons, sitting on the floor side by side and eating popcorn from a white bowl with a blue stripe around the rim. Fletcher remembered the blue stripe. He could see it clearly. Fletcher remembered everything. He will come at the heart. No fucking around. He will strike it for the heart, like a man who would kill a vampire. He will not want the TV station, Escobar asked, or the government radio station? First the radio station on Civil Hill, Thomas had said while the cartoons played. By then, it was the Roadrunner, always gone in a puff of dust just ahead of whatever Acme Roadrunner catching device the coyote was using, just beep beep and gone. No, Fletcher said. I've been told El Condor says let them babble. Does he have rockets? Air-to-ground rockets? Copter killers? Yes, it was true. Many? Not many. This was not true. Nunez had better than 60. There were only a dozen helicopters in the country's whole shit-pot air force. Bad Russian helicopters that never flew for long. The bride of Frankenstein tapped Escobar on the shoulder. Escobar leaned toward her. She whispered without covering her mouth. She had no need to cover her mouth because her lips barely moved. This was a skill Fletcher associated with prisons. He had never been to prison, but he had seen movies. When Escobar whispered back, he raised a fat hand to cover his own mouth. Fletcher watched them and waited, knowing that the woman was telling Escobar he was lying. Soon, Hines would have more data for his paper. Certain preliminary observations on the administration and consequences of electrifying the shit of reluctant interrogation subjects. Fletcher discovered that terror had created two new people inside him, at least two sub-Fletchers, with their own useless but quite powerful views on how this was going to go. One was sadly hopeful, the other just sad. The sadly hopeful one was Mr. Maybe They Will, as in maybe they really will let me go. Maybe there really is a car parked on the street 5th of May, just around the corner. Maybe they really mean to kick me out of the country. Maybe I really will be landing in Miami tomorrow morning, scared but alive, with this already beginning to seem like a bad dream. The other one, the one who was merely sad, was Mr. Even If I Do. Fletcher might be able to surprise them by making a sudden move. He had been beaten and they were arrogant, so yes, he might be able to surprise them. But Ramon will shoot me even if I do. And if he went for Ramon, managed to get his gun, unlikely but impossible. The man was fatter than Escobar by at least 30 pounds, and he wheezed when he breathed. Escobar and Hines will be all over me before I can shoot, even if I do. The woman, too, maybe. She talked without moving her lips. She might know judo or karate or taekwondo as well. And if he shot them all and managed to escape this room, there'll be more guards everywhere, even if I do. They'll hear the shots and come running. Of course, rooms like this tended to be soundproofed for obvious reasons, but even if he got up the stairs and out the door and onto the street, that was only the beginning, and Mr. Even If I Do would be running with him the whole way for however long his run lasted. The thing was, neither Mr. Maybe They Will or Mr. Even If I Do could help him. They were only distractions, lies his increasingly frantic mind tried to tell itself. Men like him did not talk themselves out of rooms like this. He might as well try inventing a third sub-Fletcher, Mr. Maybe I Can, and go for it. He had nothing to lose. He only had to make sure they didn't know he knew that. So that's where we're going to stop today. And next week we will finish up this story and finish out October. So we're almost done with this year's spooky stuff. See you next week.